Thanks everyone for joining us for this CP Achieve seminar. I'm Adrienne Harvey. I'm one of the research fellows at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and I help lead a program of research into pain in children with cerebral palsy. And we do have a national Australasian Academy pain interest group. And there's a number of projects that come through that. And Nadine and Meredith, who are talking today, are both physios who are doing their PhDs on pain. But before we get going, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, which is probably very varied. And for me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present. So Meredith and Nadine. Meredith is from the University of Adelaide and Nadine is from Perth Children's Hospital, and they're both doing their PhDs on pain in children with cerebral palsy, and together they've done a lot of work together looking at how we can better assess pain in children with cerebral palsy, particularly those with complex communication needs, and making pain assessment and identification more accessible. So you're going to hear from both of them some of their current projects, and you've probably all heard a little bit from them over the years. Nadine sort of towards the end of her PhD and Meredith sort of in the middle. So there's lots that they've been doing, and yeah, it's great work. So I think Nadine's going to kick off, and we will do questions at the end, but feel free to put questions in the chat as we're going, but it's probably better if you hear both of them before you have questions because they complement each other really well.
Thanks very much, Adrienne. So, as you know, assessment of chronic pain using a biopsychosocial approach is considered best practice in other populations with chronic pain due to the unique pain experience. But comprehensive pain assessment is challenging in cerebral palsy, partly due to the heterogeneity of the population, but also the potential sources of pain. And there are many children that have lots of medical comorbidities that can cause pain. So we've been working to develop a biopsychosocial framework to guide assessment for people with cerebral palsy, regardless of their cognitive, communication, or functional abilities. Psychometrically robust tools are essential to ensure that chronic pain is identified and that interventions are monitored effectively, but their use by clinicians and people with the lived experience depends on their feasibility. One part of this study was developing a cerebral palsy specific feasibility rating tool that considered the varying abilities seen in people with CP. And Meredith and I used the Cosman guidelines to rate the measurement properties of all existing chronic tools that we identified from a structured literature review. And then we used the cerebral palsy specific feasibility rating tool to see how meaningful and how appropriate the identified tools were to use clinically. And so there were 57 tools that were identified and rated for feasibility and measurement properties. And there were just so many tools that we had to come up with a way to get rid of some of them because we had too many to take straight to a consensus study. And so we ran workshops with people who have the lived experience of cerebral palsy and also carers and parents of people who have cerebral palsy, and also clinicians. And the aim of the workshops were to exclude the tools that were really hard to understand or the tools that just weren't really relevant or meaningful for people with cerebral palsy. And you can see that the tools in the red column there, if anyone has questions after about what the acronyms mean, I can explain them. But basically, the tools in the red column were excluded by the key stakeholder group. And then the tools in the amber and the green section were considered to need more consensus. And we presented them in the next study, which was an eDelphi to screen an eDelphi study to reach consensus on the best tools to include in the final framework. So 18 tools were presented in this eDelphi study, and we grouped them into 4 sort of areas. So tools to identify the presence of chronic pain, tools that assess chronic pain interference in someone's daily life, tools that assess the impact of pain on emotional functioning, and then observational tools, which we use for people who don't have the ability to self-report, even with augmentative and alternative communication or modifications to tools. So after round one, there were 19 tools that reached consensus, and consensus was set at 75% agreement that the tool was useful or very useful in its current state or if modified. And 6 tools were represented in round two, and none of those 6 tools reached 75% agreement. And despite that, those tools listed in that second column are all psychometrically robust, and they do have a place for some children with chronic pain assessment. They just weren't considered the most useful tools out of all of the ones that were presented. This slide here shows how the tools can be grouped according to their reporting style. So what we want if at all possible, is to use patient-reported outcome measures or PROMs. And these are the tools that the person self-reports their chronic pain experience. There are also OBS-ROMs, and that includes proxy versions of the tools. And OBS-ROMs also includes the observational tools, which I've listed at the bottom of that tool there. So tools that identified pain, there were 4 tools that reached consensus in the eDelphi, and you can see them up there: the paediatric pain screening tool, the pain burden inventory for youth, the pain and bother subscale of the CP14, and we contacted the developers of that tool to make sure we could use individual domains, and you can. So that can be a really good one that some clinicians will already be using, that you can look at and see if you think, oh, this person's scoring really high in that section, you might want to do further assessment. And then the last tool in that section is the pain interference index. Interference tools, really, really important. Some of the ones that didn't reach consensus contain lots of items that require the ability to walk or run, and that's why they didn't reach consensus. It doesn't always mean that they're not a great tool for some children, as I mentioned, but basically the tool with the highest consensus was the modified brief pain inventory, and Meredith will chat more about how we can modify that to make it more accessible for young people who might have cognitive limitations or communication challenges. The other tool in the interference tools was the Promise Pain Interference short form. And then the 2 screening tools that we've already mentioned in the previous slide also have questions that capture interference, so they're listed there. The pain coping tools, so capturing impact of pain on emotional functioning. The tool with the highest consensus was the fear of pain questionnaire. That one also, the fear of pain questionnaire short form. Short forms were generally considered more feasible when chatting to people with the lived experience than the really long forms. So sometimes the long forms got excluded. And then the pain coping questionnaire short form. So that one does have a long form, but it didn't reach consensus in this study. All of these observational tools reached consensus in round one. They are all excellent assessments. The non-communicating children's pain checklist advice is not quite as feasible because it technically requires observation over a 2-hour period, but any of those tools are fantastic. And I think lots of you probably have used those clinically already. And just wanted to show you a draft of the chronic pain assessment framework decision tree that we've been working on. Basically, it's just going to be a guide to help clinicians choose what would be maybe the best tool to use if they have a patient that they're seeing in their clinic. And we're still working on this. The next step is to take this to some focus groups to get lots of ideas about what's good and what's not so good about this before we pilot implement it. And I'd love to hand over to Meredith now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadine. So yes, as Nadine mentioned, there's obviously a lot of tools that are appropriate to use at the moment, but there's also, I guess, a number that we really need to make some modifications to be more accessible, particularly to children who have complex communication needs or use AAC devices to communicate. So for my project, we decided to focus on the tools that assess that impact of pain on emotional functioning. So primarily those pain coping tools that Nadine was talking about. Obviously, we couldn't modify every single tool at this point in time. So similar, interestingly, exactly the same as Nadine, we took these tools to an online survey, so a different group of people, but same lived experience clinicians combined. And we asked them which of these tools were kind of best and which ones we should look at modifying. Very interestingly, we got exactly the same result as Nadine in terms of the highest rated tools. So in terms of pain coping tools, it was the fear of pain questionnaire for children, and that's the short form. And then we also had some multidimensional tools which had at least one item that related to the impact of pain on emotional functioning. And for that one, it was the modified brief pain inventory. So the next step was to have a look in focus groups and interviews about which modifications we should make to those tools. And the feedback from those focus groups and interviews was that there were a number of modifications that could be made. We ended up with 58 unique modification suggestions. And they were really around, I guess, categories that we had anticipated around accessibility, relevance to people with CP and comprehensibility, but also there were a number of suggestions around improving the feasibility of using these tools as well as the visual presentation. From those focus groups and interviews, we also ended up with a number of kind of general suggestions, more general suggestions. So they were things like, for wording, making sure that we didn't assume autonomy when we were writing question items or the wording questions. So, for example, asking people to consider their wants and desires rather than necessarily what they actually do, because they might not have control over that. In terms of response options, there was unanimous support for having no more than 5 response options for any assessment tool. And that was, again, to ensure that people with cognitive impairment could engage with the assessment, but also it was just felt that more than 5 is actually quite complicated and hard to distinguish between, even for someone who doesn't have a cognitive impairment. In terms of the administration requirements, so there was very strong support, again, for presenting one item at a time, and that was primarily for people who use AAC or, again, have other complex communication needs. So, as I said, we had 58 suggestions to implement, but some of them were conflicting. So, for example, we had one suggestion to add colours to the scale, another suggestion to not add colours because for someone with visual impairment, that could be confusing. So we then did an electronic Delphi study to look at which were the most important to implement. And again, we asked clinicians and people with lived experience to provide that recommendation. And for a modification to go through to be implemented, it needed to reach consensus in both of those groups. So we ended up with 21 changes to the modified brief pain inventory and 4 to the fear of pain questionnaire. So this is just an example. This is the original fear of pain questionnaire for children short form, and these are just the changes that we made. So some wording changes to be more inclusive. As I mentioned, adding pictures and visuals to the response categories and not assuming autonomy in the questions. In the modified brief pain inventory, similarly, they had the same recommendation about reducing the response options, and then also simplifying the wording, which was quite complicated. Something that came out at this point of the modification process was that even though we were going to make these changes, there was still, I guess, a large group of children and young adults who wouldn't necessarily be able to access a standard kind of pen and paper questionnaire, even with someone reading out the questions to them. And one of the suggestions from the focus groups had been to consider alternative communication frameworks for these questionnaires and having different versions. So that led us to partner with Talking Maths, which are a UK-based communication enterprise, and they've done a lot of work in, I guess, enhancing communication for people with disabilities. And we were able to work with them to create Talking Maths versions of each of the assessment tools alongside the standard pen and paper. And we've just finished pilot testing those versions, so both the Talking Maths and the pen and paper, in children and young adults with CP and across the spectrum of communication, movement and cognitive ability. So I'll just give you an example of what the talking mats looks like. So this is the digital version. There's just also like a hard copy where you just print off symbols and use them. Essentially what happens is the person is presented with an item. So this is how has pain gotten in the way with your sleep, and then they're able to put that underneath the response option that best suits them. This can then be converted into a 5-point scale. So as we do that as a scoring at the end, we can convert that into a 5-point scale, the same as the questionnaire. This is what the symbols look like, so you can just print them off and then use them. I will mention at this point that the talking mats sort of process and the framework, they do recommend that you have training to do that and to get the most accurate responses and conversations with your communication partner that you want this conversation with. But they will be, when we're finished, they will be freely available for use. These are some examples of what the modified pen and paper questionnaires look like now. So this is the fear of pain questionnaire for children. And as I mentioned, it's got some of those changes that we talked about around adding visuals and symbols. And again, we've got versions that have sort of one item per page, as well as the version that has all of the items on one page like you would see typically. So in terms of the next steps for these modified tools, we're doing some further investigation of the psychometric properties of these adapted tools. And I should have said at the outset, these tools all both have good psychometric properties to start with. So we're, I guess, hopeful that the adapted versions will also follow in that same suit. Once we've done that investigation of the psychometric properties, which will hopefully be the second half of this year, we're then hoping to be able to make the tools publicly and freely available so that they can then be used in clinical practice, but also in research. So I just want to, I guess, acknowledge the team who've been involved with this part of the project as well.